somewhere in the middle of the East River, within full view of the Manhattan skyline, sits a place that has housed more than 1 million human beings since 1932. It has been investigated by the United States Department of Justice, condemned by judges, exposed by journalists, and yet, for nearly a century, it has never stopped operating. This is not a story of what could go wrong inside a prison. This is a documented story of what did. Welcome to Rikers Island. And once you understand what happened here, you will never look at New York City the same way again. If you want the full truth, every chapter, every documented fact, hit subscribe right now to Behind the Walls Stories and stay with us until the very end. What you'll hear in the end will genuinely shock you. Rikers Island sits in the East River between the boroughs of Queens and the Bronx. It covers approximately 413 acres, roughly the size of 300 football fields, and at its peak, it held more than 20,000 people within its walls. Today, it remains one of the largest jail complexes in the entire world. But Rikers did not begin as a place of controversy. It began as a solution. In the late 19th century, New York City was a city bursting at its seams. Its existing detention facilities, places like the Tombs in Lower Manhattan, were dangerously overcrowded. City officials looked outward, across the water, to an island that had been purchased from the Riker family in 1884 for $180,000. Construction of the first permanent penal facility on the island began in the 1920s. By 1932, the first prisoners arrived. Many of them were brought in not as convicted felons, but as men and women awaiting trial, legally innocent, but warehoused on an island with no bridge to the outside world. That geographic isolation would come to define everything that followed, because when you place human beings on an island, separated from courts, lawyers, family, and public oversight, accountability becomes very difficult to enforce. From its earliest years, independent investigators flagged systemic problems, overcrowding, staff misconduct, and a culture where power went unchecked. A 1954 grand jury report documented serious concerns about conditions inside the facility. Those findings were noted, committees were formed, and the island kept filling up. By the 1960s and 1970s, as New York City's crime rates climbed and its fiscal crisis deepened, Rikers Island expanded rapidly. More buildings were added, more staff were hired, and the population swelled far beyond what the infrastructure was ever designed to hold. What was built as a solution had quietly become something else entirely. Something the city would spend the next 50 years trying and failing to fix. By the 1970s, Rikers Island was no longer simply a jail. It had become an institution, one with its own culture, its own rules, and its own deeply embedded power structures. And like many institutions that grow too large, too fast, with too little oversight, it had begun to protect itself. The population inside had surged dramatically. New York City's crime rate during the 1970s was among the highest in its recorded history. The courts were processing thousands of cases, and Rikers absorbed the overflow, holding men, women, and adolescents in facilities that were never designed for that volume. But the numbers alone do not explain what investigators would eventually uncover. The problems at Rikers during this era were not simply the result of overcrowding. They were, according to multiple independent investigations, the result of a correction culture that had normalized the use of force and then systematically concealed it. In 1975, New York City entered one of the worst fiscal crises in its history. The city teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. Budget cuts swept through every public department, including the Department of Correction. Staff levels dropped. Training was reduced. And the people inside Rikers, the vast majority of whom had not yet been convicted of any crime, found themselves in facilities that were deteriorating in real time. It was during this period that documented incidents of officer-on-detainee violence began accumulating in official complaint records. Investigators and journalists who gained access to internal documents found a pattern. Excessive force was used, reports were filed internally, and disciplinary action rarely followed. A 1979 report by the Correctional Association of New York, an independent oversight body, documented conditions that it described as dangerous and constitutionally suspect. The report cited inadequate medical care, physical abuse by staff, and an internal grievance process that functioned more as a suppression mechanism than an accountability one. What made this possible was structure or the deliberate absence of it. Rikers operated under a correction officers' union that had, over decades, negotiated contracts providing substantial protections for staff facing misconduct allegations. Disciplinary processes were slow, opaque, and rarely resulted in termination. Officers found to have used excessive force were frequently reassigned rather than removed. This was not unique to New York, but at Rikers, the scale made it uniquely consequential. With thousands of staff and tens of thousands of detainees cycling through the system each year, even a small percentage of unchecked misconduct translated into an enormous number of documented incidents. Investigations noted something else, something that would resurface in every subsequent inquiry for the next 4 decades. The people most harmed were those least able to advocate for themselves: the poor, the mentally ill, adolescents, individuals held for months, sometimes years, awaiting trial, people who, under the law, were presumed innocent. The island had not only grown, it had grown a culture, and that culture, documented investigators would later confirm, had become the real wall around Rikers Island. For decades, the warnings had been documented, reports had been filed, committees had been assembled, and each time, the machinery of institutional inertia had absorbed the criticism and continued operating. But in the early 2010s, something changed. The evidence became impossible to ignore. And this time, the scrutiny came not from a local oversight board, but from the United States Department of Justice. In 2014, the DOJ's Civil Rights Division released one of the most comprehensive and damning federal investigations ever conducted on a local jail system in American history. The report, running to dozens of pages of verified findings, concluded that the civil rights of adolescent detainees at Rikers Island were being routinely and systematically violated. The investigation focused specifically on male adolescents, young men between the ages of 16 and 18, held in the Robert N. Davern complex on the island. What federal investigators documented was not isolated misconduct. It was, in their own language, a deep-seated culture of violence among correction staff, one that had been allowed to persist unchallenged for years. The DOJ found that adolescent detainees were subjected to unnecessary and excessive use of force at a rate that investigators described as shocking. In a single year reviewed during the investigation, there were hundreds of documented use-of-force incidents involving adolescents alone. Injuries were sustained, medical attention was delayed, and in many cases, staff reports describing the incidents bore little resemblance to what security camera footage, where existed, actually recorded. The report documented a practice investigators called punching as a first resort, the use of physical force before any attempt at de-escalation. It found that supervision was inadequate, that senior staff frequently failed to intervene when excessive force was applied, and that the internal investigation process was so dysfunctional that it effectively shielded officers from meaningful accountability. One finding in particular drew national attention. Federal investigators noted that adolescents who filed complaints about abuse were, in documented cases, subsequently subjected to retaliation, further isolation, restricted privileges, or additional use of force incidents. The system designed to hear their grievances had, in documented practice, been turned against them. New York City, under legal pressure, entered into a federal settlement agreement. A federal monitor was appointed to oversee reforms. New training protocols were mandated. Use of force reporting requirements were overhauled. And yet, even as the settlement was being implemented, new incidents continued to emerge. A 2015 investigative series by the New York Times, drawing on internal DOC records obtained through public records requests, found that use of force incidents had not declined following the federal agreement. In some categories, the numbers had increased, the federal hammer had fallen, the monitors were in place, the reform language was written. But inside the walls of Rikers Island, the documented pattern, force, concealment, and the protection of the institution over the people inside it, showed no sign of stopping. The question was no longer whether the system was broken. The question was whether it could be fixed at all. Every statistic in every federal report represents a human being. And at Rikers Island, the documented human cost of institutional failure is not abstract. It has names, it has faces, and it has cases that force an entire city to confront what was happening on that island in the middle of its own river. Perhaps no case made that confrontation more unavoidable than the case of Kalief Browder. In 2010, Kalief Browder was 16 years old and living in the Bronx when he was arrested and charged with robbery. He maintained his innocence from the first day of his arrest to the last. Unable to afford bail, he was sent to Rikers Island to await trial. He waited for 3 years. During those 3 years, from 2010 to 2013, Browder was held at Rikers without a conviction, without a completed trial, and for a significant portion of that time, in solitary confinement. He was a minor held in adult jail conditions. Security camera footage obtained and later published by The New Yorker in 2014 showed documented incidents of physical assault, both by corrections staff and by other detainees, during his time on the island. In 2013, the charges against Kalief Browder were dismissed. He walked out of Rikers Island, but the damage was irreversible. He struggled profoundly with the psychological consequences of his detention. In June 2015, at the age of 22, Kalief Browder died by suicide. His case did not create the problems at Rikers, but it gave those problems a face that the public could not look away from. His name was cited in city council hearings, in federal briefings, and in legislative sessions at the state level. New York State subsequently passed legislation informally linked to his case, limiting the use of solitary confinement for individuals under the age of 18. Browder's case was not isolated. Investigators and journalists documented a broader pattern of detainees, many of them young, poor, and without legal representation, spending months and years on Rikers awaiting trial for charges that were eventually reduced or dismissed entirely. The Vera Institute of Justice, a nonpartisan research organization, published findings showing that the majority of people held at Rikers on any given day had not been convicted of the charge for which they were being held. They were there because they could not afford bail, amounts that in many documented cases were set at $500 or less. The island, designed to hold people temporarily between arrest and trial, had become, for thousands of people each year, a long-term punishment imposed before any verdict was ever reached. Medical failures compounded the picture. The death of Jerome Mordo in 2014, a 56-year-old homeless veteran with a history of mental illness who died after being placed in an overheated cell, was ruled by the New York City medical examiner as a result of hypothermia. His cell temperature had reportedly reached over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. These were not allegations. They were documented findings, official rulings, court records. The numbers at Rikers had always been staggering, but it was the names, Browder, Mordo, and the thousands of undocumented others, that finally made the scale of the human cost impossible to dismiss. By 2016, the documented weight of nearly a century of failures had reached a breaking point. Federal monitors were inside the walls. The name Kalief Browder had become known across the country. And for the first time in Rikers Island's history, a serious, citywide conversation was underway, not about how to reform the complex, but about whether it should exist at all. In April 2017, an independent commission convened by New York City Council Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito released a landmark report titled A More Just New York City. The commission, formerly known as the Independent Commission on New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform, concluded, after months of research and testimony, that Rikers Island should be closed permanently. The report was unambiguous. It found that the island's geographic isolation, its scale, and its deeply embedded institutional culture made meaningful reforms structurally impossible. The recommendation was to replace Rikers with a network of smaller, borough-based facilities, closer courts to families, and a public oversight. In October 2019, the New York City Council voted to adopt a formal plan to close Rikers Island by 2027. It was a historic vote. For the first time in the jail complex's 87-year history, an official legislative body had set a legal deadline for its closure. But legislation and reality move at different speeds. By the early 2020s, the closure timeline was already under pressure. Construction of the replacement borough-based jails faced legal challenges, community opposition, and significant cost overruns. The COVID-19 pandemic created a crisis inside Rikers that drew fresh federal scrutiny, with court-appointed monitors filing emergency reports in 2021 describing conditions that had deteriorated to the point of constituting a public safety emergency. A federal judge overseeing the ongoing consent decree took the extraordinary step of threatening to appoint a federal receiver, effectively removing operational control of the jails from the city entirely. It was a legal mechanism rarely invoked, and its consideration alone signaled how far the situation had fallen outside acceptable boundaries. The New York City Department of Correction disputed some findings. Reforms were announced. Staffing plans were revised, and the closure date, one set firmly at 2027, began to slip in public statements from city officials. As of the time this documentary was produced, Rikers Island remains open. The federal monitor remains in place. The consent decree remains active. And the borough-based jail construction program, the legal foundation of the closure plan, continues to face delays. What Rikers Island represents is not simply the story of one jail in one city. It is a documented case study in what happens when institutional scale outgrows accountability, when the structure designed to hold people becomes, itself, impossible to hold to account. For nearly a century, the island sat in the middle of the river, visible from the city, inaccessible to it. The gates have not yet opened for the last time, but the record is clear. The investigations are documented. The names are remembered, and the story of Rikers Island is not finished. Subscribe to Behind the Walls Stories for new documentaries every week. Bell turn on notifications. You will not want to miss what comes next. Speech Balloon drop a comment. Tell us, should Rikers Island be closed permanently?